I will tell you what this coin means more in a moment, but today we're going to answer once and for all that big question. Can you tell if somebody is lying by observing their body language? Are there so-called telltale signs of body language that give away liars? And to answer this, we're going to look at data from an exhaustive literature review article that looks carefully at all of the top 16 telltale signs of deception. Here's a quick look at that list. We're going to look at the data on each one of these in more detail in the video. And what I'm about to say is probably going to upset some people. There is no reliable proof that lie detection through so-called body language analysis works. There is no learnable method that anybody knows or that anybody can teach you to tell if somebody is lying by looking at their body language, microfacial expressions, eye movement, touching their face, or any of the top 16 alleged nonverbal cues. FBI interrogators can't do it, the CIA can't do it, and they certainly train their people in a method, but it doesn't work, and I'll explain why they still do it. Many people claim they can do it, but nobody can do it reliably when they are tested under experimental conditions. As you'll see, our ability to reliably identify false statements from true statements using body language cues is no better than a 50% success rate, give or take a few percentage points, no matter what method is used. That's the same success rate you get guessing randomly on a true-false quiz or flipping a coin to decide. On an exam, that would be a failing grade. And just for fun, I used a coin flipping website simulator and flipped the coin 100 times, and it landed on heads 52 times and tails 48 times. So let's see how the research findings on this compare to random guessing. Researchers Bond and Apollo, for example, analyzed data from almost 25,000 observers. These participants watched videos, listened to audio tapes, and read transcripts from truth tellers and liars. On average, 54% of their judgments were correct. That's just slightly higher than guessing at a 50-50 success rate. But those results go down to 52% when they looked specifically at body language and other visual cues. This is all hovering just slightly above 50% and are still considered failing grades and in the same range as flipping a coin over and over. I'll explain later in the video, but there's really only one bright spot in the human lie detection data. But alas, it has nothing to do with body language. So we'll get into these top 16 behaviors in a moment. Big picture, Vrij, Hartwig, and Granhag published an extensive review of literature on deception in the Annual Review of Psychology in 2019. I'll put a link in the description to that article. This is a reputable, peer-reviewed, social scientific academic journal. Each researcher on the team has been studying this topic for years. After investigating virtually every credible study and method, they concluded the following. The nonverbal cues to deceit, that is body language, discovered to date are faint and unreliable, and people are unreliable lie catchers when they pay attention to human behavior. The connection is faint and unreliable, just a pinch higher than 50-50. In other words, there are no telltale signs that somebody is lying. You cannot read people looking at their so-called body language like that. Here again is that list of the top 16 alleged telltale signs of deception. We'll look at each one in a moment. The authors say that these are the 16 nonverbal cues that are often claimed to be diagnostic cues to deceit on the internet, in popular magazines, unscientific books, and in US police manuals. A meta-analysis of studies, including almost 25,000 participants, showed that 13 of the 16 cues are not related to deception, and the 3 that are diagnostic show only small effect sizes. That means that 13 out of the 16 cues show nothing, no connection to lying, and only 3 showed very weak connections to lying. None of these cues are even moderately associated with lying, let alone having a strong or telltale sign that so-called experts claim. Let's quantify each of these 16 signs. A table from the article shows the first part of this list of 16. These are screenshots from the article, might be a little difficult to read, but the analysis shows that behaviors like hesitation, speech errors, and we'll come back to a high-pitched voice in a moment, speech rate, latency, or silence between questions and answers, and pauses have no relationship whatsoever to deception. These scores are at or near 0. These cues are not typically considered body language, but they are nonverbal cues connected to the sound of our voices, which some so-called experts often talk about. They are vocal or audio nonverbal cues. Just how weak are these results? Well, in terms of a measuring stick, the authors explain that a score of 0.20 is the threshold for demonstrating a small size effect. For the sake of comparison, a 0.50 score would be considered a medium size effect, and nothing on the list comes even close to that. According to the authors, a score of 0.80 would be a large size effect. And as you can see from these results, there's virtually nothing to work with here, and only a high-pitched voice meets that basic 0.20 threshold, but it's a weak connection and hardly worth mentioning. The trouble is, in real life, our voices might go higher pitch for all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with telling a truth or telling a lie. And that's the good news from this research. When it comes to visual nonverbal cues, or what some people call classic body language, this is usually the focus of these so-called experts. The situation gets even worse. 4 out of these 10 nonverbal cues actually have a negative association with deception, which means that liars were less likely to do these behaviors than truth tellers. But the differences are still very slight, and those differences don't really mean anything, except that they have nothing to do with lying or telling the truth. Averting somebody's gaze is almost 0. Facial fidgeting is when somebody touches their face or their own hair. That's almost 0. Other kinds of self-fidgeting shows a negative association. Leg movement, which some so-called experts talk about, has a negative association. Again, which means that truth tellers did this slightly more often. Almost all of the behaviors had scores that were at or close to 0, which means no effect at all. And we can see that only the general category of fidgeting shows a slight association with lying, even though that connection was very faint, and it doesn't even reach the bottom threshold of 0.20, which would be considered a small effect size. Here is a ranking of the top 16 nonverbal visual and vocal cues they tested in order of effect size. But honestly, ranking these according to strength is almost pointless because only 3 of the 16 showed even a hint of potential promise. A midpoint summary here is that none of the top 16 alleged telltale signs of deception make a meaningful difference when tested under experimental conditions. These cues have either a very weak association with lying, only one of which actually qualifies as an official weak association, no association with lying, or even a negative association with lying. Collectively, these cues have a faint and unreliable connection to deception. And we're talking about the top 16. There were dozens more they tested in the depths of the research that didn't even make this cut. So if you think of a behavior that you don't see on the list, it's even less relevant than these top 16. In fact, the article shows that scrutinizing what people actually say, their words, in addition to how they act, is a slightly more promising way to detect deception than visual cues. But the effect sizes are still really small. For example, this one isn't body language, but discrepancy or ambivalence can mean that a speaker says things that are internally inconsistent. They say things that contradict themselves. And that makes sense to me. If what people say shows inconsistencies, then I can see why somebody who is lying would do that more often than somebody who's telling the truth. By the looks of it, finding an internal contradiction is the best way to catch a liar, but that still only has an effect size of 0.34. That's mainly about the speaker's words contradicting themselves. But this behavior could also mean that they say one thing, but their nonverbal cues appear to contradict their words. They combine these inconsistencies in the article in the same category, so it's hard to separate the results. But some people call this nonverbal leakage. For example, they say the word yes, but they shake their head no. Examples like these are often taken as the ultimate sign of deception by these so-called experts, and that we should believe their body language, not their words, when we see a contradiction. And this is a better result than the other behaviors, but a result of 0.34 effect size after looking at a meta-analysis of a combined 116 studies is not a result that anybody should be claiming is proof of anything. It's fair to say that a nonverbal contradiction between words and what you say, or a contradiction in your words, could occasionally signal a lie. But 0.34 is still below a medium effect size. And these were experiments where the people involved either made a true statement or a lie. In real life, nonverbal leakage can be the result of other thoughts, situational pressures, or anxiety that have nothing to do with deception. Verbal and vocal uncertainty is another positive association. For example, if a speaker sounds uncertain or has difficulty answering a question, there's a relatively small 0.3 effect size between that behavior and deception. I can see why difficulty answering a question might draw our attention if we're on the lookout for deception. But again, these behaviors don't even have a medium effect size. And showing difficulty answering a question is not what anybody would normally refer to as body language. An effect size like this means that liars do these behaviors some of the time and slightly more than the average truth teller, but it's still considered only a weak connection. Again, I'll put a link to the entire full-text PDF article in the description below the video. And if for some reason that gets broken, the full citation is in this video and in the description as well, and you can find it in the Annual Review of Psychology. The article looks at the various methods as well that have been attempted over the decades and shows that none of them hold any water. Neurolinguistic programming, or NLP, for example, is often the approach that most so-called body language experts cite, but there's no credible data from the little NLP research that was done to support claims about deception detection. The article looks at lots of other approaches and none of them work reliably. And we're focused on a large data set in this video within that article, but the article's filled with additional results that will truly open your eyes to the non-existent foundation that so many so-called body language experts at deception claim to stand on. The article also talks about how many people in the general public falsely believe that it's possible to reliably detect lies by looking at people's nonverbal behaviors. The authors say that individuals hold misbeliefs about nonverbal behavior and deception that appear very hard to debunk. A while back, I did some polls on this. On YouTube, 68% of thousands of respondents agreed with the statement, yes, body language is a reliable way to detect a lie. On LinkedIn, the results were very similar, although the sample size was very small. 72% believed it was reliable. The vast majority of people in both polls, and I would say the general public, believe that you can tell if someone's lying by observing them. But believing it does not make it true. It does, however, give us reason to think about the cues we may be giving off without realizing it. I'm not surprised by these results. We see this idea promoted in movies, television shows, mass market books. Law enforcement and government agencies teach versions of this. This gives the appearance of credibility. And of course, YouTube is filled with videos with people claiming or implying that they are human lie detectors. It seems like the only place you will not find these claims promoted is in the academic studies that were done under experimental conditions. The same research article explained that the so-called body language deception experts claim their method of lie detection works without providing the crucial evidence that supports this claim. That means these so-called deception experts offer no proof that their methods work. I'm showing you here data from a study. I'm talking about a sample size of 25,000 participants. I'm citing the study fully. I'm linking to the article so that you can read it yourself. In contrast, you'll notice that these self-proclaimed experts often vaguely refer to a study. They tell a story about a study they read, but they almost never present actual data that we can examine or even fully cite the actual study they were talking about so that you can look it up on your own. Other so-called deception experts act as if they have a special talent or a secret method or proprietary technology or private data that allows them to make these claims. They might even claim that they teach these skills to high-paying corporate clients or that they receive special training from the government. But none of that bolstering matters because there's no proof that the methods work. And if they had a reliable method and convincing data, they'd be sharing that data set publicly, like we do in every other field of academic study. Other researchers would then be able to scrutinize the data and repeat the study to test it. That's how the scientific process works. To paraphrase Jerry Maguire, show me the data. And some people claim to have some special ability or unique talent, but that it can't be taught, but they can personally do it themselves. Well, if that's true, they should allow themselves to be tested under experimental conditions. I can entertain the hypothesis that some people notice what other people miss, but show me a passing grade. Show me that you can do it 70% of the time for a grade of at least a C-. I'll have you on the channel. We'll do a big interview about it. If you can perform at a 70% or better success rate on camera, I will give you a cash prize. I would be genuinely thrilled about that result and thrilled to make a video like that, and I know my viewers would be as well. So I do want to pause to make a couple of caveats. Some individuals are terrible liars. I get that. And you may be able to tell when a certain friend is lying because you know them well. Maybe you've caught people lying in the past. I know I have. But if you think about the way you discovered and confirmed the lie, I almost guarantee there was a lot more going on than simple nonverbal cues like somebody touching their nose. You very likely had to dig into a situation more deeply and piece it all together with some verifiable evidence to separate truth from lies. Maybe you found something on their phone that eventually proved they lied. But that has nothing to do with the subject of this video. Those are individual situations where you had a variety of real evidence that you could look at. And for every lie you caught, you very likely missed another lie. Another caveat is that I don't believe most of these so-called deception experts are deliberately misrepresenting the research. I'm coming at these claims pretty hard, but I'm not trying to pick a fight or make enemies with any particular people. Notice I haven't named names because I don't think they are deliberately dishonest people. In fact, I have a lot of empathy for most of them. In some cases, they have simply been told incorrect information and they believed it. They trusted what they were taught by non-experts. They maybe misunderstood the research they've read, or they don't realize the dangers that come with basing conclusions on a small sample size. In some cases, they've done their best, but the research methods they've used in their own studies have problems that need to be fixed, and maybe they're not aware of that. That's why it's so important to publish their findings publicly, put their data out there, because well-intended people can still make mistakes. And understanding what research conclusions actually mean is sometimes very difficult, especially when the results are mixed or borderline, like the results we've been looking at. I think that many of these so-called deception experts are just excited to share what they believe is an accurate understanding of the research. I get that. But to these individuals, I encourage you to read the article I mentioned in the description as a starting place and keep reading all of the available research, much of which is on the reference list of that article. The more research you read, the more you'll see that there's simply no credible foundation for claiming generalizable telltale signs about body language and deception. I want to conclude this part of the video with the following advice for you. First, scrutinize any claims about body language and lie detection because there's no such thing. Scrutinize any claims from so-called experts about nonverbal cues revealing somebody's true nature or real thoughts. Claims like that go too far. There's no way anybody can tell the quote real truth by looking at a small micro expression or other tiny behavior. And never trust an analysis that uses very short, hand-picked video clips or just a few seconds or a freeze frame, but leaves out the rest of the conversation or context. Cherry-picking any short moment or freeze frame of a single passing gesture or facial expression is like cherry-picking any data. It's the easiest way to misrepresent a situation and make it look any way they want to. Now, you can keep watching videos like that if you want, of course. I'm not bashing any specific channels. Many of those channels are fun and fascinating, and I've watched lots of videos like that myself, but only for entertainment purposes. Just be cautious not to take what they say seriously. So the big question remains for me is that if non-verbal deception claims are bogus, then why should we look at nonverbal communication and what people call body language? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are still hundreds of applications for studying nonverbal communication more generally. And while we're going to stop short of talking about actual deception detection, looking at nonverbal behaviors can be a starting place to ask more questions. Somebody might not be acting like themselves or acting overtly suspicious. Law enforcement professionals, for instance, notice these signals all the time, not as proof of anything, but as a reason to look further into an issue or to ask follow-up questions. That's why law enforcement agencies teach methods they likely know don't work more than 50% of the time. They have no choice but to at least try to see if people are giving off unusual signals. And sometimes it pays off. There have been many times where one person in a crowd is acting differently from other people in that crowd. Video analysis was one of the ways the FBI identified the Boston Marathon bomber. When the first of two bombs went off, the entire crowd looked in the direction of the explosion, but the bomber looked in the opposite direction and immediately started walking away. That wasn't proof that he was the bomber, but it was different. It was a lead, a starting place for the FBI to ask more questions and eventually identify and then successfully capture the guy who was the bomber. So body language is an unreliable approach, but law enforcement agencies do their best to look for any cues because they have to try. And it's certainly not the only method of investigation they are using. In the same way, I posted a video about some suspicious answers and behavior from Bill Gates in an interview he did with PBS about Jeffrey Epstein last year. The way he acted in the video was not proof that he was intimately involved in Epstein's sex trafficking activities. To me, his answers and his behavior seemed way off, and I called his behavior hinky or suspicious. I got the strong impression that there was a lot more going on than what he was saying. But I don't know if my interpretation is accurate or that other interpretations are wrong based upon the video alone. It's debatable, and both sides of the discussion make some fair points. The point is, we can and should study and notice cues like this and use them to dig deeper into what's happening. But the micro expressions and nonverbal body language cues themselves don't tell the whole story. We have to make sure we stop short of claiming that any of that is definitive evidence of deception or claim to know what's, quote, really going on beneath the body language. There's absolutely no research to support that. And on the flip side of that, understanding nonverbal cues is important for us personally, based upon the way we communicate. If you have a bad habit that shows up on this list of 16, then you may want to work on getting rid of them. You may be a 100% honest person, but if you have a bad habit of touching your face when you speak or shaking your leg or averting eye contact, then you may be creating the wrong impression on others. Maybe you're just nervous, but many people could mistakenly believe that you're not telling the truth because they assume these cues are real. Now, as mentioned at the very beginning, there's one bright spot among all this bad news. When participants in the large study we've been talking about heard a person on audio only and could not see their body language, they caught liars a little more often. So they could hear their words and the sound of their voice, and when they were able to do that, they were accurate 63% of the time identifying liars. Now that's better than guessing purely randomly. If this were a true-false quiz, they'd still score about a D, but I'm fascinated by the results. Now, I'm not sure what we could do about this in daily life. It would be difficult, for example, to only listen to a person's voice and words in face-to-face conversation, where lie detection would matter most for the average person. Either way, while listening to voices is a noticeable bright spot, that does nothing for the so-called body language experts, because when participants could see and hear the subject, those scores went back down to about 50%, as mentioned earlier. In other words, looking at body language makes people worse, not better, lie catchers. In the end, so-called human lie detectors are about as accurate as flipping a coin. I hope this video settles it once and for all, but probably not. I'm sure there's lots of misunderstandings about nonverbal communication and deception, and those will go on for many years. Either way, I hope you found it helpful and educational. Until next time, thanks, God bless, and I will see you soon.